past several months, we've been talking about the design argument for the existence of God. Specifically, I've pointed to signs in the laws and constants of our universe, in our specific location within the universe, in the molecular machines inside the cell, and even in DNA, the building blocks for all life. And all of these signs tend to indicate that an intelligent mind was behind it all. In other words, they all point to God. But before we move on to our next argument, I want to respond to one more objection. Many skeptics claim that if God really is some sort of cosmic designer, then he's a pretty poor one. They claim to be able to point to several instances where his designs have been suboptimal at best. If a perfect being designed all life, then why does the human eye have a blind spot? Why do pandas have a thumb that operates so poorly? Christian apologist Douglas Groothuis summarizes the skeptic's argument like this. Number one, if God, an all-powerful and all-knowing being, created life, then it would show no design flaws. Number two, life evidences design flaws. That is, it is not optimally designed because we can imagine another design improving on it. Number three, therefore, life is not designed by God. Number four, therefore, life is the product of Darwinian evolution, which is non-designed and non-directional. Now first, we can eliminate line 4 from the argument right off the bat. While it may be true that Darwinian evolution is true if statements 1 through 3 turn out to be true, it doesn't logically follow that it must be true. Maybe life came about in some other third way. So before we can jump to statement 4, the Darwinian evolutionist would have to provide some affirmative evidence for it. But are statements 1 through 3 true? Well, if statements 1 and 2 are true, then statement 3 does logically follow through a logical law called modus tollens. But in order for that to happen, statements 1 and 2 obviously have to be true. And as it turns out, neither of them really are. The first statement, that if God created life there would be no design flaws, it's nothing more than a self-serving assumption. How does the skeptic possibly know what God would do? Let me give you an example. I'm an experienced video editor. That's actually part of my job here at Trinity. Now, the day before I'm filming this, I slapped together a quick little 46-second video for our lead pastor, Jay Jackson. It was just a little joke that I knew he'd appreciate. I never intended for it to be seen by the public at large, so guess what? It contains quite a few things that people could point to and claim were flaws. It was something I was just throwing together really quickly in about 30 minutes, just for fun. So I didn't bother lining up every mask point as precisely as I could, or spending a lot of time picking out just the right fonts. None of that was necessary for the particular purpose I had in mind. Similarly, unless the skeptic claims to be able to get inside the mind of God, they can't possibly know why God would choose to create the way he did. Just because God is capable of designing something better doesn't necessarily mean he would choose to do so. Besides, if everything in nature had a completely optimal design, that would actually be evidence against Christianity. The Christian story says that we are currently living in a fallen world. Now, God is eventually going to make everything perfect, but he hasn't done that yet. And the fallen world isn't just some tangential part of our theology. It is absolutely central to the whole Christian message. So if Christianity is true, we would expect to see suboptimal designs in nature as a result of the fall. But as it turns out, many of the things skeptics love to cite for so-called design flaws have turned out to be anything but. For many years, one of the favorite examples was junk DNA. Supposedly, there were certain sections of DNA that didn't contain the code for anything. They were mere junk. But in more recent years, this has turned out to not necessarily be true. Several portions of non-coding DNA, for example, have been shown to be used to produce non-coding RNA, such as transfer RNA, regulatory RNA, and ribosomal RNA. So what was once thought to be useless DNA actually has turned out to be quite useful. There was no design flaw after all. Now, the same can be said of the panda's thumb. The late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould claimed the panda's true thumb is committed to another role, too specialized for the different function to become an opposable manipulating digit. so the panda must use parts on hand and settle for an enlarged wrist bone, and a somewhat clumsy but quite workable solution. The fact that Gould concedes that the panda has a quite workable solution in and of itself defeats his objection. After all, as we've already seen, there's no reason to believe that God is required to always provide the most optimal design possible. But he didn't leave the panda without a way to grasp. But Gould's assessment of the panda isn't even accurate. In more recent research, admittedly after Gould passed away, Hideki Endo from the University of Tokyo pointed out that the hand of the giant panda has a much more refined grasping mechanism than has been suggested in previous morphological models. So time and time again, the so-called design flaws turn out to be not so flawed after all. Now, this doesn't mean that no creature could benefit from any improvements whatsoever. Of course they could. That's what God will accomplish in the new heaven and the new earth. But the notion that the evidence shows God to be some kind of incompetent designer is just plain false. That wraps up our discussion of the design argument for God. But we are nowhere near the end of the pile of evidence that God has left in his creation to point towards his existence. Next week, we're going to start on a new argument, a favorite of author C.S. Lewis. It's called the argument from reason. See you then. God bless.